Okay. All right. Item 1.8 is the record of assemblies of councillors for November 2018.
Happy to move, Madam Mayor.
Second.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis, and seconded by Councillor Rotino. Thank you.
Put it to the vote.
Should we vote to it?
Put it to the vote, Madam
I'll
Mayor.
put the motion to all those in favour. Carried unanimously.
Madam Mayor, could I just interject really quickly? Sorry, I did notice earlier on we may have missed 1 or 2 points. I don't think we voted on them. We seconded them, but they weren't carried. Should we redo that?
For which?
I believe it was the procedural items at the start of the agenda. There was the first 2 items that were brought to the vote. They were seconded, but they weren't voted on.
Okay.
True, too. Perhaps we could run through. There was a couple of other points too that you may have skipped, Madam Mayor. Perhaps you could have a look at the beginning.
It was the confirmation of minutes and, yeah.
Petitions and other things. Yeah.
We haven't got there yet. We brought it forward. So confirmation of minutes was Councillor Peltz and Councillor White. All those in favour? And the next meeting doesn't need one. Okay. So the record of assembly, that was carried, wasn't it? Okay. Item 1.9 is a petition. We have received a petition. Sorry, thank you, Ms Bennett.
Councillors, this is essentially a holding report. We've received a petition lodged by Jamie Savoury requesting that a commercial expression of interest process be initiated for council's property at 55 Palmers Road, Lakes Entrance. Unfortunately, the petition was received too late for us to prepare a substantive report. So in accordance with our local law number 1, it's tabled for your information, and we will bring back a substantive report to the first meeting in 2019.
Thank you, Ms Bennett. Are there any questions from the councillors?
Happy to move it.
Thanks, Councillor Roberts. Thanks, Councillor Peltz. Put the motion before you. All those in favour? Against? Motion carried. Okay. Deferred business, item 3. Nil received. Okay, item 4, councillor reports. Councillor Rotino.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I've submitted my monthly report. I would like to speak briefly to a couple of items quickly. The first is in relation to the event on the 28th of November, the Gippsland Lakes Community Health Walk to Change the Story. This event was also attended by, it was Councillor Pells, White, Ellis and yourself. And the estimated crowd in that day was in excess of 1,000 people, which when you think about an event around East Gippsland or indeed down the main street of Bairnsdale was... We're right?
Sorry, Councillor.
Is an exceptional sight to see when you see a sea of orange. But why was this walk so important? On average, 1 woman is murdered by a current or former partner every week in Australia. Just reflect on that statistic for a minute. Most recent statistics show that East Gippsland is amongst the highest out of the 79 LGAs in reportable incidents for family violence. Family violence contributes to more burden of disease, i.e. the impact of illness, disability and premature death than any other risk factor for women aged 25 to 44. The focus is on violence against women specifically and deliberately because research shows that it is preventable. As a society, we can prevent this kind of violence with the following actions: challenging and the condoning of violence against women, promoting women's independence and decision-making, challenge gender stereotypes and roles, strengthening positive, equal and respectful relationships. The walk to change the story was about educating the East Gippsland community about how we can prevent violence against women. Many thanks to the CEO, Sue Medson, Bree Nichols, Nicole Lewis and the team from Gippsland Lakes Community Health, and I was proud that East Gippsland Shire was one of the major sponsors, so thanks Kate for your team for their involvement there. The second thing that I would like to talk about was on the 7th of December, the East Gippsland Art Gallery RAP 2018 exhibition, which finished up their exhibitions for this year. It was generously sponsored by Simon Anderson Consultants. Bansale EGAG RAP entrants were in the running for $1,000 first prize. The art was judged by Gippsland Art Gallery curator Erin Matthews, and the two highly commended went to artists Cherie O'Donnell and Daniel Jenkins. But what I'd really like to just quickly mention was the winning prize, which was by local 17-year-old artist Lauren Hickey for her realistic and delicate pencil drawing, Waiting for Rain. It was an absolute awesome and incredible picture, and I won't do it justice, but it's basically a pencil colour, and it looked like a photo. It was incredible. In fact, if it was for sale, I would have bought it that night. No, that's about all. Thanks, Madam Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Rotino. Councillor Roberts.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I don't have anything to report on this month. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Buckley.
There we are, pleasant show. There were about 200 plus people there, and the rain held off just long enough for the show to be over. Councillor Rotino was there, and the Mayor, Councillor O'Connell, did a pleasant introduction. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Buckley. Councillor Ellis.
Oh, thank you, Madam Mayor. To speed things along, I like my predecessor. I've submitted a report. I corroborate the words of Councillor Rotino in relation to the March Against Violence. It was a terrific event and sent a clear message in relation to our community. I also touch on the fact that we, as a group of councillors, visited the Western District, where we met with councillors and officers from the Southern Grampian Shire, council at Hamilton, officers from the Iluka Mineral Sands Mine at Douglas, and then a few of us went on to meet with local community members from the vicinity of the mine, and then finally a meeting with officers and the Mayor of the rural city of Horsham, who gave us a wonderful insight into the issues relating to the topic we've just discussed. And I'd like to, formally again thank them for the fact that they readily gave of their time, knowledge and experience. But personally, to me, it was greatly appreciated and provided us with a great insight into the matters. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. Councillor White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, of course, I did go on that walk, and thank you very much to Director Kate for finding an orange T-shirt that would actually fit me for the walk. But it was very serious, and it was great to see so many people participating in that walk. I've been to many things in this last month, so I won't cover them all. But one event recently at Fisherman's Landing at Lake Tyers was something that the Shire sponsored in kind and assisted in this float, they call it, which is a very impressive floating art studio, which will be moored out on the lake, and it'll be for a lot of the local artists to just sit out there and do their work, live on board, and I believe that the Aboriginal artists are going to be the first to use it and do some work, and it's in an absolutely beautiful setting out there, so peaceful and tranquil and with great scenery, so I'm sure they'll come up with some great inspiration. With that, the other thing I'd like to just add a little bit more to our tour that we went on to the Western District. Firstly, thank you to Paul for his efforts in arranging. I thought it was a great itinerary, and it was a good cross section of the people that we needed to hear from, just to fill us in on how they had experienced mining, sand mining. But firstly, we went to suppose, being in the middle of Melbourne, it was probably the headquarters of DELP, to be spoken to by fellow in charge, Jeff Ralphs, and he indicated to us in that discussion that they had already begun peer reviews from the EES as a result of our passing our motion at OMEO, and these were already for the key issues in that EES, so they're already moving to have a second look at those things, which was good news. When we went to, once we got to Hamilton, their experience with sand mining was actually a good experience. They, at the time, the Iluka were looking for a site to build their processing plant. Hamilton had high unemployment, low agricultural commodity prices, and the area had been what I'd call decimated by blue gum plantations, which actually took away the families and replaced them with trees with very little labour required. So they were in a spot of bother economically, and they just happened to have industrial land that suited. They had a good water supply. They weren't far from the port to export the product, and they had also a very good power source. So it was a win-win for them because it created employment for a lot of those people. The actual Iluka trained the locals to work at the plant, and after all that, you know, they got all the employment and the benefits, and they did not have a mine in the Southern Grampians Shire. So that then took us to Douglas, where we got a tour from the Iluka staff, and it was funny that the first person I saw was the same person that was managing me in West Australia. Rod had been sent over. They must have heard that John White was turning up at another mine tour, so he came specially to manage me again. But they were very good. They were quite open and frank. They showed us through this pit 23, which was looks like it's just going to remain an open pit for some time because the plant at Hamilton is now in recess. They've shut it down because they have no product to process there. So at the moment, the Horsham Rural City Council have just this big open pit, which is still going to probably continue to cause dust hazards for the locals in that area. They then showed us a rehab of a farm that had not worked out, so they were good enough to actually take us to a farm that was still struggling due to subsidence because of lack of proper compaction, and the farmer was still, I guess he was still being compensated because he could not use his land in the way that he normally would have. And then it was very interesting to go to the Canagol Hall and listen to people who had been directly affected by the mine. Their big concerns were that they, for some reason, many of the locals having an unprecedented increase in cancer cases locally. They can't be definitive about it, but they're just saying it's a little ironic that so many of their locals are crook at the moment. They also said that the dust could not be controlled on this mine site, that continually they would see big clouds of orange dust going across the properties. And then the other thing was that at that Douglas mine there's a big water supply which is to remain on site, and there'd been at least two breaches where that water had escaped into the local creeks. So, and they also were very critical of the damage done to the roads by the heavy vehicles in their area. So, so then when we got to Horsham, they gave a great presentation. Unfortunately, because it was so long ago that this mine had begun, many of the staff who would have had first-hand knowledge of what actually happened at the time were no longer employed. They'd moved on, retired. So the staff that were there were good enough to just look through the records and come up with a few answers to our questions. And they had one big criticism, and it was to do with the pit and the way the planning system had worked against them, because now the mine is closed down. It's not rehabilitated, but it's actually changed its name to a landfill, which puts a different perspective on it. So it's just a big open hole in the ground waiting to be filled. And that cost them a lot of money trying to have that stopped, and they lost their case at VCAT. So there was lessons to be learned there, because the criticism at the moment is that once a mine is operational, the mine plan can be changed without notice, and that can put you know, a council or a community you know, in a worse position without any consultation. So hopefully that's got a little bit of information out to you about our tour of the Western District. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor White. Councillor Peltz.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd just like to concur with my colleagues and just add a bit more to Councillor White's report on the Western District. Just a couple of notes that he didn't state. That was his oral report. He's submitted one. Yep, he will submit one. Hope it's longer. Anyway, I just wanted to say with regards to that, one of the things that wasn't mentioned was the fact that the sites that we actually attended were not close to vegetable growing areas, whilst they were actual animal areas. There were sheep and cows. They weren't mining vegetables as such as what happens here. Did you see any vegetables or cropping of? Oh, they had crops. But not vegetable growing such as what we have in the Lindenow Valley, and they also didn't have their main water supply within, 5 kilometres of where they were mining or processing either, like we actually have. So they were two highlights that I wanted to state. One of the other concerns was the Pit 23, which was the high mineral uranium level toxic waste dump that they're actually using. They didn't seem to know where the runoff was going, and they said whilst they're doing soil or water testing downstream from it, they've noticed a lake which is about 15 kilometres away at the head of the lake, which would very well be most presumably a downstream fill from the mining section. They're losing fish, and they used to have a yabby or a crayfish, or freshwater crayfish of some type, which is now becoming extinct down there too. So these were sort of some highlights that made the hairs on the back of our neck stand on end, and things that we actually needed to take away with us and take into consideration with regards to our decision this evening. I just wanted to highlight, I've sent my report in, but I did want to say I attended the Timber Towns on Thursday last week, and the highlights from that was the fact that they're doing an agricultural white paper, and they'll be addressing better planning in it with regards to agriculture. And they also said that they're needing better processing of permits with regards to haulage. And that was something that was highlighted in that, was also highlighted in the MAV Transport and Infrastructure meeting, which I attended later that day. And they're also looking at hub concepts are being worked upon with regards to native forest issues, and they're also looking at silviculture is something that is crying out for in the native forest area. It's needing to be looked at and addressed as in a farming sector sort of environment. The MAV meeting, I'll just briefly go on to that. The Transport and Infrastructure meeting, there's a lot of reports and policy getting done at the moment, and Transport Victoria is just developing its policies. There's roads of strategic importance being done. There's the corridor monies being divvied out. One of the things I found interesting was that the western colleagues of the state, where the green triangle is, they seem to be getting some leverage on the Princess Highway damage that's getting done by all the transport trucks over there. and the state government is actually working on a 2-for-1 option. They're talking about 3 lanes being, expanded to, and they'll be using 2 lanes at a time and being able to swap the middle lane into either direction. So that was a curious one, and we were sort of trying to, with the seats work that we do, I was trying to highlight to them not to settle just for 1 or 3 lanes, but to settle for 4, so we have 2 lanes each way, which is something that we're working upon to be a standard for the Princess Highway from Sydney across to Adelaide, and we're trying to make sure that they stick to that so that it doesn't get tinkered with at any stage. Shared transport services for local governments is something that's being highlighted. Strategic planning days are coming up for council's inputs early next year. Briefing, no, early next year, 30-year infrastructure strategy. Basically, they'll be looking at councils in February, March next year to be putting into that, and also considering the future vehicles, which are the electric vehicles. And I've sent round to the councillors the cost analysis of those. And Councillor Tui did email back to me about was there any comparison to petrol and diesel, and we verbally spoke around the table and just said that the diesels were still the best cost-effective vehicles for councils to be running, but in the Melbourne metropolitan areas they're looking at reducing the smog emissions, and so the electric cars are starting to come on stream down in Melbourne, but they probably won't be required within our region other than electric stations, recharging stations, for quite some time yet. So thank you, that's all, Madam Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Peltz. My report's been submitted. I'll just talk about one event that I went to on Sunday, which was the Bairnsdale Toy Run, which is a fantastic event that helps families in need during this Christmas time. Aside from the weather, there was still a good turnout of around 100 riders, and they went up through Bruthen, now and back through lakes and pick up toys along the way, and that'll go to around 150 families who have registered with the Salvation Army, and those toys will be distributed to families, so a very worthwhile cause. And I'll leave it at that. And we can move on to officer reports. 5.1.1, new fees and charges, mobile stage and outdoor cinema. Thank you, Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillors, you'd recall this item at the council. At the September council meeting, council endorsed the public advertising of proposed fees and charges for the mobile stage and outdoor cinema. These fees were advertised for public comment for a period of 28 days with no feedback received. And I guess I'll just reiterate the principles of setting those fees. There's a community rate, which is essentially below the cost of providing the service. Purpose of this is to reduce the financial barrier for community use of a beneficial service. The commercial rate is provided at above cost rate. The purpose of this is, I guess, it's not council's not subsidising private event or potential commercial activity. It's also at a level that does not compete with private providers. So given that there was no feedback received, these are now presented for endorsement.
Thanks, Mr. Richards. Are there any questions from the councillors?
Just one, Madam Mayor, and that is, Mr. Richards, will there be a reporting phrase directed to council on the success or otherwise on perhaps an annual basis or quarterly basis on the use of these two items?
Yes, that is the intent, and I believe it was mentioned at a recent briefing that we'll certainly monitor the use of it and the financial state of, or the financial situation, and report that back to council. I would think it would take 6 months to provide a reasonable 6 months.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. There's a recommendation for you. Do I have a mover, please? Thanks, Councillor Rotino. And a seconder. Thanks, Councillor White. Are there any speakers? For or against? No? Okay, I'll put the motion to you. All those in favour? Against? No? Motion carried. Thanks, Mr. Richards. 5.2.1, review of options, vegetation management plan for the grey-headed flying fox colony, Mitchell River, Bairnsdale. Thanks, Ms Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report is presented tonight following Council's request that officers prepare a review of the options that are available to councillors in respect to the revegetation management program that we've been attempting to implement on the Mitchell River. You'll see from the report that we've detailed all of the background and provided the context of the current situation that we find ourselves in, which is quite challenged in terms of being able to realise the original intent of the approval that we actually have for removal and replacement of the vegetation that the colony currently uses. Officers have undertaken research to look at what the potential options are available to council. The reality is that none of these are particularly attractive in that they all continue to place a significant obligation on council and also to require us to go through modified approvals processes if we're going to pursue any of those as council. What we have done though is been able to undertake some conversation or meetings with representatives from the Department of Environment, Land Planning and Water and Planning, and also Parks Victoria to understand whether there is any appetite to look at an interagency strategic approach to how we determine the best future management options and land management options for the land that the colony occupies. As indicated in the report, we think this more strategic approach to what is a really complicated matter for council is something worthy of exploring. It gives us the option to understand all of the potential options that are available using the expertise of a wider range of organisations and people. And it also enables council then to use that information to decide whether it believes it is a relevant role for council to manage this part of the Mitchell River corridor. So while it's not a definitive recommendation tonight in respect to the options, options that council might actually take, it's a recommendation to investigate further what we think is something that is worthy of further consideration that might result in a more strategic and collaborative approach to dealing with this issue. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ms Nelson. Are there any questions, councillors? Councillor Roberts.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Ms Nelson, in regards to developing a new strategic management plan, an interagency strategic management plan, does that have any effect on the current plan, current requirements around stage 1?
No, the requirements in respect to stage 1 and the current approval would remain in place. So the approval that we have from the Commonwealth Government is current through till April 2022. So it's not intended that council takes a position to change the circumstances. The reality is that it's not possible for council to do any work in the near future anyway. But you will see in the recommendation that I'm asking council to reaffirm the commitment to constructing the alternative access and revegetating stage 1 as a recognition that that is an obligation that we have. While our ability to do that has been frustrated by the conditions that are imposed on us, we'll endeavour to complete that work as a priority. Yeah. In all likelihood, we wouldn't be able to start any of that work till April, May, June timeframes, given the conditions that we have at the moment.
Thanks, Ms Nelson. Councillor Rotino, did you have a question?
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Kate, what discussions, if any, have been held with other user groups to this point?
You mean user groups of the Mitchell River Walking Trail?
Yeah, stakeholders.
There have been discussions with the park run operators in respect to our decision to close the trail and to work with them to understand how we reroute their 5-kilometre loop. And there have been, council has obviously had a discussion with the Friends of Bats and Habitat Gippsland as part of working through this process. There haven't been specific discussions at this point in time with any other stakeholder groups about this matter, and I think that's partly why the recommendation is to investigate this strategic approach and provide opportunities for community engagement into it, so that every viewpoint can be represented.
Thanks, Kate. Given the sensitivities around this issue, I'd like to see a really extensive communications plan to attach this recommendation. Is that something that you can add to it?
I've got a point that I was going to make an amendment all along those lines.
The recommendation is to investigate this, and I'm happy that, you know, to take advice from our communications team about how we communicate that we're going to investigate this as an option, and what we're reaffirming we will do. The fourth point in the recommendation is to prepare a further report on the outcomes of those discussions. I think that's the more substantive part of the process that would be communicated to the community, and that should include, you'll see that I've recommended a number of things that should be contained in the strategic management plan if that's going to be developed, and that part of that is to make sure that there is an opportunity for community engagement input into that process. It's premature probably to say exactly whether that will happen and how that will happen. So just a little cautious to say more than this is the avenue that that I'm prepared to recommend at this point in time.
Councillor Peltz.
Yes, I was just going to ask, I was going to request that we do an amendment and request Council, Delp and Parks engage with the community of interest groups and bodies to best address the community concern, because it's a really important part of the Bairnsdale community, that walking track. It's used by, you know, not only the runners and the, you know, the elderly, the young mums, and there's a lot of engagement groups. So whilst there's a lot of people that are concerned about the bats, there's people that are against the bats. You know, I think we should be a lobbying body that could actually bring all groups together to have some kind of happy medium and how to work through the group. And I think it's also Council's position to be informing the community on what's coming, filtering in from other bat communities around the nation, and how those communities are actually living with bats wholeheartedly around them. So I was wanting to try and up it with putting in a .5 if we can. What do you think, councillors? Are you thinking it's too premature at this stage, or?
We'd have to move an amendment after the motion's been put, so if you're wanting to do that.
Look, I think it is really important for council to be involved in this process, and mostly because of the importance of that walking track as a piece of really heavily used recreational infrastructure in Bairnsdale. And so I think, you know, our obligation is to understand how we do navigate this issue for the community. I don't know whether you'll ever come up with an option that everybody agrees with, but if there's a way to actually navigate it in a more constructive way with both perspectives, then I think that's something worth pursuing and investigating, which is what the recommendation is really trying to say here. And after we've done that, then council can decide, you know, through that process how it wants to continue to engage the community. But for council to do this alone would be a significant undertaking, and that's why I'm recommending that we do that in partnership, hopefully, with the other government agencies that either have a role or an interest and who may be able to support council to do this work.
Councillor Ellis.
Just taking that degree further, what we have is we have a series of community groups looking for action and some sort of response from council in it, and I accept what you say about us providing leadership, but I think it's probably time we should up the ante and set some sort of timeframes in terms of reporting back, and I think that's where Joe may have been going, was that this issue has been on, the management of the foxes has been going on now for quite a number of years and for varying reasons, but it's now time for us to perhaps up the ante and say, well, we need a report back to council, and then we have a further discussion, and then bring this urgency to the attention of our colleagues at DELP and other places to speed up the actions that are being done. And I think that might be something that could be considered in relation to your recommendation.
Yeah, perhaps if I can just comment on that too, because, you know, we've been able to get the attention of both agencies, and there's a lot of goodwill at a Gippsland level to work with us to understand how best to go about this process. But I don't want to necessarily ruin that goodwill, if you like, by putting unrealistic, you know, it'd have to be really realistic timeframes. I appreciate that this is a matter that's been going on for quite some time, but you know, we need to take the time to actually navigate this and get it right and try and get these agencies to work with us. So I'd just be a little bit hesitant about, you know, demanding that happen. The reality is, and I've said this in the report, the presence of bat colonies, whether they're grey-headed flying fox or others, in Victoria is a significant emerging issue. And so we're really asking DELP to start to get their head around how are we going to, as a community in Victoria, manage the presence of bats. So I think we're going to be testing a little bit exactly how we would go about this kind of exercise. But at the moment we do have a lot of goodwill to do that.
I'll just come back. Well, I accept that there's a process of goodwill, but there's also needs to be a process of action as well. And I think that if there's goodwill and a cooperative behaviours, then they should become cognizant of our, you know, well, I'm not going to say sense of urgency, but we do need to up the ante a little bit. It's like passing on their advice to them, saying, look, this is becoming another issue within the community, which it is. It is a passionate issue, so we kind of need to be able to manage that, and so they need to respond to the urgencies that we have. And I think rather than just going along saying, look, we're working with you because you've got goodwill, it's really nice, and they're nice people up the top end there in Main Street, but the reality is we've got to address the different issues, and I think we just need to bring it to their attention, either by advocacy through council or through the officer interaction. It needs to happen. So whether we ask for this to come back to council with some sort of response in February or March might be more appropriate. Keep the pressure on ourselves to put the pressure on our colleagues in DELP.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. Are there any further questions? This is a recommendation before you. Is there a mover? Thanks, Councillor Ellis. Do we have a seconder? Thanks, Councillor Roberts. Any further speakers?
Simply encourage councillors to support the recommendation before you, and to note that there is a wish to increase the urgency in responding to a successful outcome for the proper management of our bat colony. Thank you.
Are there any further speakers? If not, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Motion carried.
Madam Mayor, just on the request of the gallery, I'd like to bring forward item 5.2.5. It's a planning permit application. Are we able to bring that forward?
Do we have to move it?
You can. You just have to move the motion.
Yep. So, Councillor Peltz, have you moved it? Do we have a seconder to bring that forward? Councillor Roberts, thank you. Put it to the vote. All those in favour? It's carried. Thank you. Okay, 5.2.5, planning permit application 85 2018 T application for a 2-lot subdivision and development of a dwelling at 4 Vigilantes Road, Wak Wak. And we have 2 speakers to the agenda. So the first one is Mrs. Linda Swift.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I live on the northern boundary of this property. There has been many subdivisions of this property over the years that I've been there, gradually chopping it away. But another one that you may not be aware of is on my boundary itself. There was a subdivision done there. You needed to know what happened there to know how deceitful this man is. My neighbour. He wished to remove protected vegetation under your Vegetation Removal Act. Your council members told me to stop him. I stood in front of the bulldozer to stop him on my land and asked him to leave. He knocked my husband down. He went to hospital, and while I was attending him in hospital, unconscious, Mr. Hutchison sent the bulldozers in and took away 1 kilometre of trees, stumps and all. I reported it to council. Council couldn't go any further without further proof of this damage. And until early this year, I finally got that proof to give you. The proof of how big the trees were, because it's a high impact area of a powerful owl, a very shy creature. Now another subdivision is going through. I'm saying to you, there is deceit there. He was only doing it to sell the land to make money. We are in an area of large farms. It's not Eastwood, it's not Shannon Waters, but if you allow him, others will follow and start chopping up large productive land. I have been open and honest with the council in all ways, but as the landowner, I am responsible for that loss of that land, and I am a criminal because of it, under your laws. You oversee that law. I am a criminal now. I stand to lose my land over this, and I can prove everything I say. Now, if you allow this land to be chopped up, there will be another subdivision. He will bring in more subdivisions and more subdivisions until it's chopped up, and we are Eastwood out there. And we only 2-phase electricity out there. You can't support the houses. Now, you may say, I'm a greenie and tree hugger and all the rest of it, but I respect your laws in saying you need a permit to take away the trees that are protected by the state. And so far, I'm the criminal. I'm just astonished that you're going to allow it all to be chopped up. These big properties support people, and the rates will go up as all these little properties come in place, and the big farms that are around in 90% of the area, they'll look at it and say, oh, well, if we want to make a bit of money, we'll just chop off a bit of land too. So think very carefully before you allow somebody who I have proved to Robert Pringle, your planning officer. He has the information, and I have absolutely proved to him, and that information has now gone to your legal representative, as I understand, for prosecution. Think very carefully before you allow people to deceive you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Swift. We have another speaker, which is Mr Richard Hoxley from Crowther and Sadler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to this item this evening. With respect to the last submitter, I will say I'm totally unfamiliar with the issues that she's referring to with respect to the vegetation removal. It's the first, certainly, that we've heard of any issues having arisen of the nature that she's mentioned, so I don't wish to comment on those issues or anything else that might be subject to any further investigation by council. I am here to speak against the current recommendation by the officers that's before you in respect to the application for the subdivision of the land, which is to excise an existing dwelling and to facilitate the construction of a new dwelling on the balance allotment. And seek that Council, in fact, determine to support the proposal instead of the motion before you to refuse it. Despite the concerns within the officer's report, the proposed subdivision is not dissimilar to numerous applications that Council have approved since the introduction of the East Gippsland planning scheme in 1999, and with subsequent changes and introduction of the farming zone in 2007. Until recently, our experience has been that these types of applications that genuinely seek to excise a dwelling onto quite a small lot has not been met with any opposition by Council, and with the number of applications that are advertised and go through the public process, receive minimal feedback by way of objections. Nothing has effectively changed in recent times that should give cause to Council to change its position on these types of applications. It's a legitimate opportunity that's afforded within the zone under the farming zone to excise a dwelling. It is a specific and limited opportunity that is afforded. It's not a free-for-all to create any size lot, but certainly acknowledges the opportunity to excise or create a small lot containing an existing dwelling. The common practice has been, albeit not prescribed within the planning scheme, in these circumstances that a balanced lot be equal to, or at least equal to, if not greater than, the minimum lot size prescribed under the zone. And in this instance, it's 40 hectares. So starting with less than 40 hectares, you've effectively got, it's not supported. And we accept that in our role in dealing with landowners, often before any matter is received by Council or inquiry is received by Council. So there's a lot that gets, or a lot of inquiry that comes to us that Council would never see or deal with, because we simply say it won't be supported. In this instance, however, the proposal seeks to create or excise an existing dwelling onto a lot of 1.9 hectares, or less than 3 acres. It's not a large lot. It's not a large area of land that might be considered lost to agricultural production. It will remain, there will be a balance allotment remain of in excess of 54 hectares, more than the minimum lot size otherwise prescribed under the zone. Hence I say, this, under these circumstances, up until now, it's been regularly accepted by Council as a suitable outcome consistent in achieving both state and local planning policy and the provisions of the farming zone. There are a couple of VCAT decisions that the report refers to that provide, we'll say, negative decisions with respect to the subdivision of land contained within the farming zone. These decisions date back to 2007 and a perhaps somewhat more recent one of 2012. There are some distinct differences in those decisions to this application before you. In the 2007 decision, it dealt with a parcel of land at the time that was limited to only 12 hectares and contained a dwelling. The applicant at that time was seeking to utilise the dwelling excision provisions to create 2 lots, one with a dwelling and a small lot at 8 hectares as a vacant parcel. That is inconsistent with the farming zone, and understandably, VCAT refused it. The latter application in 2012, we had some dealings with, but not for the applicant, but in fact for other concerned parties and objectors. In that instance, the property contained a little over 40 hectares in total, but 2 dwellings. The report doesn't detail the fact that, again, in that instance, the application was refused on the basis that each lot to be created, albeit each containing one of the 2 dwellings, would be less than 40 hectares, failing the basic test, if you like, that's generally been well accepted by this Council and by others, including VCAT, as a general acceptance of the minimum standard. And in that instance of the Lancaster Road matter, the tribunal acknowledged that it's common, or not unusual, if you like, for dwelling excisions to be undertaken in a manner that would retain a large balanced allotment. So in that respect, this proposal is consistent with the thinking of VCAT in respect to other decisions. Also, I'm interested by the fact that there isn't a more comparable VCAT decision within East Gippsland that's been presented within the report. I'd therefore suggest on that basis that the proposal has been otherwise consistent with practices. Now, the matter also refers to the concerns about a loss of productive agricultural land. Now, from our understanding, there have been improvements to this property undertaken by the current owner and our client, including pastoral improvement, weed eradication and new fencing around the property. So they are investing in the land to optimise its production. The loss of less than 2 hectares of land by virtue of the dwelling excision will not in any way result in a measurable loss of agricultural production that otherwise exists on the land today. It's there for dry land grazing. The surrounding properties are effectively used in the same manner. The level of productivity will not be lost from that which is currently available today. The other aspect of the application the officer's report raises concerns with is in respect to bushfire risk. Surprisingly, this was the first we heard of this concern was in reading the officer's report after being published within the agenda on Friday. We've dealt with many applications for both houses and subdivisions in the farming zone that are affected by the bushfire management overlay, and been successful on numerous occasions as well in obtaining both council and CFA support for proposals. This application has followed the correct process in assessment of the bushfire risk and determined and identified bushfire or mitigation measures that can achieve and satisfy both state policy as well as the provisions of the bushfire management overlay to minimise the risk to life and property and prioritise the protection of human life. The assessment of both the wider landscape hazard, closer hazard in terms of the assessment area of 150 metres, which is the standard assessment area, has all been undertaken as part of the application, together with the preparation of a bushfire management plan to provide mitigation measures for the proposed dwelling. The application has been referred to the CFA, and the CFA has accepted the information that we've provided and the bushfire management plan as proposed. They do not and have not objected to the proposal, and they have not raised any concerns otherwise with the proposal or its failure, if you wish, as concerned by the officer's report, that it doesn't otherwise meet state and local state planning policy with respect to bushfire protection. I put it to you that this application is consistent with all the relevant provisions of both policy and zone and overlays as contained presently within the planning scheme, and call on council to support the proposal as prepared. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mr Hoxley. We'll now hear from the officers, Mr Martin Ireland, Mr Aaron Hollow and Ms Nicole Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to bring this back just to Planning 101, just to planning basics. We have before us a planning application that is to be assessed against the planning scheme of today, not the planning scheme of 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. We have a planning application for a 2-lot subdivision in the farming zone and construction of a new dwelling. The new dwelling requires a planning permit by virtue of the bushfire management overlay. Under the farming zone, when you subdivide and create a new lot that is larger than 40 hectares, the use of land for a dwelling on that lot becomes as a right. The farming zone assumes that by being able to subdivide down to 40 hectares per lot, that is the minimum lot size that's prescribed. That's the base. You can seek, in some circumstances, and the tribunal has been explicitly clear, that it is a provision that is to be used sparingly and not on a come one, come all basis. Now, the bar was largely set in 2007 by that decision on Being Warden Road. It was one of the first in East Gippsland and one of the first farming zone decisions that the tribunal dealt with. Similarly, in 2012, that was a subdivision that sought to subdivide two houses onto separate lots. Something as what a consultant these days would call quite simple was refused because it was creating a small lot in the farming zone, which is an outcome that is not supported under today's policy. And it's not supported under today's policy because the breaking up of farms, or the fragmentation as we call it, of agricultural areas is not something that's sustainable. It's not something that's supported. So namely, like, why is this stuff inconsistent with the planning scheme is that it will lead to the breakup of an agricultural holding, create the potential for amenity conflicts in that if you create a small lot which creates a rural living lot or a rural living outcome, people move there with an expectation of a nice quiet lifestyle. Which does bring me to the fact that we have large amounts of land set aside for rural living, and that if this proposal were put forward in the rural living zone, we wouldn't be here discussing a recommendation for refusal. We have over, and it's in one of the maps in the report, the colour-coded zone map, where there are large amounts of land set aside for rural living, large amounts of land set aside for farming. The location that we are talking about is not in a rural living corridor, it's not in a rural living zone, it is a farming area. And the creation of a small lot, again, it brings me back to the point about creating a small lot, and the fragmentation of agricultural land is a negative outcome, not only in terms of the planning scheme, but in a general agricultural sense. Further on, there is the potential for the increase in the burden on council resources, in that when you have more people moving into the landscape, there's the call to seal roads, to collect bins, etc. And that it actually does permanently remove land from agricultural production. Now, in this application, we have proposed lot 1 and proposed lot 2. Proposed lot 1 will have the house, the stockyards, the shed, most of the farm infrastructure. Now, it's a bit of a quirk that we have an application that seeks to have us believe that it's a good agricultural outcome and that no land will be lost from agriculture, yet there is just over a hectare that will be given over to rural living uses and takes the farm infrastructure with it, which is a negative agricultural outcome. Turning to bushfire, this is a location of high bushfire risk, and whilst the CFA has responded to their referral, it was in the context of the application met the application requirements under the bushfire management overlay, namely that the new house will be built to a prescribed bushfire attack level, and there is the ability for defendable space to protect the house. What the CFA don't do is that they don't answer the fundamental question of should you be letting someone build there in the first place. That is something that rests with council. And from a planning policy framework point of view, it is one of the grounds for refusal, that this is a high risk, not just any risk, high risk location. So I think I've covered the planning scheme side of it. There is one objection that's been received. Should council vote to issue an approval, that approval may be taken to the tribunal. And I think on that note, I'll open it up to questions.
Thanks, Mr Ireland. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Peltz.
Yes, Mr Ireland, would you refresh us on the bushfire overlay, because I was in the impression that it's relevant for, I thought it was 150 metres away from a proposed dwelling, and to me this looks like much more than that.
In October last year, the bushfire management overlay mapping was amended by the state government, and the criteria was that any standard vegetation that was larger than 4 hectares would be included in the overlay, as well as a 200 metre buffer around it. So it would appear that that is the catalyst for the extent of the mapping on this property.
Any further questions, councillors? No? There's a recommendation before you. Do I have a mover? Thanks, Councillor Peltz. Is there a seconder?
Come on, guys, wake up.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. speakers for?
Look, this one's probably a curly one. I can see, you know, both sides of the argument here, but I mean, the bottom line is it'll probably go to VCAT either way. I would hope that we're being advised properly by our council staff and that the actual application is not acceptable to be followed through with. So on that ground, I'm happy to move the recommendation that's put before us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers?
Just simply to say the recommendation is consistent with the council's planning policies and has been so consistent that I can recall a number of cases similar to this coming before council with a similar recommendation from officers. So I encourage councillors to support the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. If there are no further speakers, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Councillor Roberts and Councillor White against. Motion carried. Thank you. Okay, we'll move back to 5.2.2, Capital Discretionary Fund Allocations 2018-19, Round 2. Mr. Wayne Richards.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillors, the Capital Discretionary Fund provides a small capital budget that allows Council to be responsive to community needs and changing conditions. You recall in September that 11 projects were approved for a total of 145,000, but through that process we kept some budget for some additional opportunities. And I guess an example of this is in recent times Apex approached us to donate some playground equipment, but required some capital budget for installation. So you'll see that is included in one of the recommendations here. So through this process, a further 6 projects are recommended for a total of $86,000, noting that there were some savings made from the previous projects, but these are now presented for approval. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Richards. Are there any questions, councillors? Councillor White.
Yeah, I was just looking at the costings for that road sign. Is that a large amount for a sign? It must be a fairly impressive sign they're thinking of. Number 1.
Yes, well the intent is I guess the intent is one of those quite large signs, so the cost of construction and installation, yes, is quite significant.
Any further questions? Councillor Rotino? Okay, we have a mover. Second, Councillor Peltz. If there are any further speakers, I'll put the motion to you.
I'd just quickly like to thank Mr. Richards and his team for identifying these worthwhile projects, so thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Rotino. Any further speakers? All right, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Motion carried. Thanks, Mr. Richards. And 5.2.3, Swifts Creek Memorial Pool Subsidy. Mr. Wayne Richards.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, councillors, the Swifts Creek swimming pool, I guess, is a somewhat unique arrangement. So it's a swimming pool managed by a committee of management in partnership with the Department of Education. But over the past few years, council has provided financial support. You'll note the feasibility study, which is provided as an attachment, obviously supports this model. 3 years ago, there was a 3-year council resolution for financial support, but that has now expired. And also, in recent times, the committee requested a slight increase in this to meet the increasing costs of operation. So it's proposed that this arrangement continue with the proposed increase of $2,000. And there's also an inclusion of a CPI increase annually. So the recommendations within the report. Happy to take any questions.
No further questions? Yeah. So Councillor Peltz moved. Councillor Buckley seconded it. Yep. Are there any speakers?
that community infrastructure such as this is really important to the remote areas, and I can't think of anything better than to encourage children to swim. And a lot of country children can't swim, and it's really important to make sure they have access to this facility. I'm happy to be supporting this motion tonight. Thank you. Councillor Buckley. Excellent. Okay, if there are no further speakers, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Motion carried unanimously. Thanks. Thanks, Mr Richards. 5.2.4, Environmental Sustainability Strategy Annual Review 2017-18. Wayne Richards.
Thank you. So, Council, the purpose of this report is to update the work in this area and particularly the outcomes achieved in the sustainability area. There's obviously a large amount within the report and there's been an enormous amount of work in this area, both from the sustainability team as well as the rest of the organisation. Just to touch on some of the highlights. So, Council was a state finalist in the Integrated Stormwater Design category at the 2018 Stormwater Awards. That was for the East Bairnsdale Stormwater Enhancement Project. Council energy use reduction of 1,063 gigajoules, which was 4%. There was also a reduction in CO2 emissions of 12%. Part of this was actually that there was a change in the emissions factor, but obviously that reduction in energy use was important as well. That said, there was an increase in expenditure of $100,000 based on the increasing costs of power. As well as this, there was a 94 kilowatt solar system installed. 94 kilowatts of solar systems were installed on council facilities. Council engaged in the solar bulk buy, and there's currently 266 kilowatts installed across the Shire. And you'll recall one of the key outcomes of that was that money for that power use would remain locally as opposed to going to external power suppliers. There was support for protection of management of remnant native vegetation and 67 waste education sessions reaching over 2,500 people. So the report's provided for council endorsement, but also for approval to release to the community. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mr Richards. Councillor Roberts, question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. How's the take-up been on the solar bulk buy program? Has it been successful? Have we had a lot of pickup?
I guess I would say yes, in comparison to other, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but in comparison to other like councils, the take-up's been quite good. And I guess I believe in early stages, I recall a figure of 100 kilowatts being a reasonable target. So the fact that we've reached, what was it, 266 kilowatts. And I guess another component of it, which we haven't been able to measure yet, but I guess the appreciation, I guess, of solar or the increase in understanding of solar from the community may mean that we believe that there's been an increase in solar installations, not necessarily through the solar bulk buy, but through other installations across the Shire as well.
Question, Councillor Rotino.
Happy to move the recommendation, Madam Mayor.
Yeah, thanks,
And
Councillor
so I'd
Rotino.
like to thank Wayne again, particularly with the solar stuff. It's more disposable money that's staying in our economy and not going to the big energy companies. So well done.
Good point. Thanks, Councillor Rotino. Any further speakers? No? I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? Motion carried. Thanks, Mr Richards. Okay, 5.3.1, proposed sale of 5B Grevilla Avenue, Meetung. Miss Bennett, is it you? Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This report is quite a complicated one. Essentially, circumstances have conspired to deliver an outcome whereby a property was essentially left landlocked, and a solution was found to that through which council could acquire a piece of land, subdivide it and subsequently sell part of that to provide legal access to this property once consolidated. There is a long history. The negotiation between council officers and the property owners have been ongoing for quite some years, and the history is not altogether clear in all aspects. However, what is clear is that there's a landholder who is landlocked, and there is a responsibility, officers believe, for council to attempt to resolve that situation cooperatively with the landholder. So the suggestion is that we go outside the terms of our current policy for the sale of land, which we are entitled to do on resolution of council, having regard to circumstances that apply, by selling the property at less than market value. And in this case, we're proposing half price, which is something that was, we are advised, negotiated back in 2015. So I think the circumstances are set out in the report, and I'm very happy to respond to any questions rather than work through all the detail of the report. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thanks, Ms Bennett. Councillor White.
The reason for discounting it, is there a specific reason?
Yes, one reason that we regard perhaps as the principal reason is that it was a decision of council that created the landlocked situation with the best intentions, of course, and in the betterment of good planning outcomes, but nonetheless we believe it's incumbent on council to now find a resolution to that situation, and that it shouldn't come at major financial impost to the citizen.
Councillor Roberts.
Actually, just since I've asked that, raised my hand, I was going to question the Section 223 process, but it's been accounted for, so thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Peltz.
Can I just ask, I mean, this is probably the elephant in the room, but is there any relationship to the landowner and anyone in council? Just precarious and checking?
I'm certainly not aware of any relationship, and if the question pertains to the reason for the
oh no, it's just clearing ourselves from the decision making. That's all.
Okay, I'm unaware of any officer relationship to these individuals.
Any further questions?
If there's none, I'm happy to move the recommendation, Madam Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Ellis. Do we, Councillor White? Okay, if there's no further speakers, I'll put the motion. All those in favour?
I'm against.
Against? Councillor Peltz. Motion carried. Thank you. Okay, item 6, urgent and other business.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm just, can you just bear with me? I bring this up. Madam Mayor, I ask that the following motion be admitted in as a matter of urgent and other business. And that motion is that Council agrees to reimburse Councillor Ellis for all legal expenses incurred as the result of statements he made during the mayoral election of 30th of October 2018.
You need a resolution then to determine when you're going to accept it.
Okay, so do I need to ask for a seconder? Oh, no, move it. Sorry. So Councillor Ellis is moving that? Is that how it works?
Yeah, it doesn't say you can't.
No.
Yeah. Okay, so do we have a seconder for the...
No, I'm afraid I can't second that because I wasn't here at the time. I was in Sydney. And I have to abstain.
I believe you're acting in Councillor Roller's side.
Okay.
I'll put it for the...
Do we need to declare a conflict?
Yeah. Madam Mayor, because this directly affects myself, I will declare a conflict of interest and I will have to leave the chamber. And I put the motion as it is for consideration of council.
Sorry, Mr CEO, sorry.
Through you, Madam Mayor, appreciate the conflict that's been declared, but it's actually not on the agenda yet, so it needs to be voted on to determine whether it will actually be accepted and discussed.
Okay, so that being said, I'll put that motion to the councillors. So all those in favour to bring it to urgent and other business? So 3. Councillor. So no vote. So all those against? So that's 3-3.
So it's effective.
So did you get that? So 3-3. And me and Councillor Buckley abstain. Just Mr. CEO will.
Through you, Madam Mayor. So in this basis, if it was tied and there was one abstention, then an abstaining vote is actually in the negative. So effectively, the motion is lost.
Okay. Okay. Council will now close the meeting to the public in accordance with the provisions of Section 89.
Madam Mayor, I'm happy to move that we now close the meeting to the public in accordance with the provisions of Section 89(2)(d) of the Local Government Act 1989 to consider items 7.1 to 7.7 as these items relate to contractual matters.
Thanks, Councillor Retainer. Do we have a seconder? Thanks, Councillor Peltz. I'll put the vote. All those in favour? Motion carried.